So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Evan Blecher, Guillermo Paraje, and Michal Stoklosa. Dr. Evan Blecher is an economist in the Fiscal Policies for Health Unit at the World Health Organization in Geneva. He was previously in the Tobacco Control Economics Unit, where he led tobacco tax efforts in the African region. Prior to joining WHO, he was a senior economist at UIC and the American Cancer Society. He was also the project director of the Economics of Tobacco Control Project and an honorary associate professor in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. Evan received his bachelor's degree in economics and business strategy from the University of Cape Town, a master's in economics with distinction from the University of West England, Bristol, and a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town. Dr. Michal Stoklosa is a senior economist on the UIC team, and before joining UIC, he was a principal scientist at the American Cancer Society. And he has numerous publications, and he's co-authored policy reports and book chapters, including in the Tobacco Atlas. Michal received a master's in managerial economics from the University of Warsaw, a master in economics from Georgia State University, and a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Guillermo Paraje is a professor of economics at the University Adolfo Ibáñez Business School in Chile. Previously, he was a consultant for the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations Development Program, UNICEF, and other international organizations. He's also a member of he was also a member of the Presidential Commission to Reform Health Insurance in Chile. Guillermo received his bachelor in economics from the National University of Cordoba in Argentina, a master of philosophy, and a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge in the UK. So, what a distinguished panel we have. I'd like to welcome you all. And now I'll turn things over to Evan, our first presenter. Evan, over to you.
Thanks, Erica. I'm going to try and keep this brief as possible so that we can give as much time as possible to Michal and Guillermo to talk about the toolkit. But what I want to talk about first is a white paper that we did last year, that we published last year with Tobacconomics, and is available on the Tobacconomics website. I'd also just like to acknowledge the contribution of Hannah Ross, who was the co-author on this white paper and who's on the call listening today. The white paper tried to focus not on original research, but distilling a lot of the research that we have on illicit trade in tobacco products globally, and to try and understand what the implications are for policy and the key messages that we can take from this literature that will able to inform tobacco tax policy globally. The white paper has a lot of empirical examples, a lot of really fantastic figures as well. But we've able also to distill that into 5 key messages that are contained in a much, much shorter policy brief that's also available on the website. If you can go to the next slide, please. Really what we did is we tried to understand what really illicit trade means for the context of practicing tobacco taxes and implementing tobacco taxes globally. And we were able to really define 5 key messages that we found. The first is that the industry, the tobacco industry, the manufacturers really have used and framed illicit trade as an issue that allows them to oppose, to slow down, and in many cases, in some cases even to reverse tobacco tax increases and tobacco tax policy reforms. They really are able to sort of cloud the policy space to a great extent so that our policy goals, at least of reforming tax systems and increasing tobacco taxes, gets undermined. Secondly, one of the key ways they're able to do this is to exaggerate the levels of illicit trade, to generate inconsistencies in illicit trade data, and to try and identify an always increasing trend in illicit trade. That the recent, to some extent, that they always try to find that the recent tax increase has resulted in a recent increase in illicit trade. What we're able to show through empirical evidence is that in many cases, the data is not of very high quality, not replicable. And when we compare it to data that and evidence that follows better methodologies, more transparent methodologies, and methodologies that are applied correctly, we find that in many cases, levels of illicit trade are actually lower than the industry say, and that the trend doesn't always and often is not increasing. I'm going to come back to this point a little bit later. The third that we find is that in many cases, tobacco taxes are not the key driver or the determinant of illicit trade. There are many other reasons, from weak tax administration systems that are not unique to tobacco taxes. Often we find high levels of illicit trade in countries that have challenges with governance, with corruption, and generally the general capacity of government to implement policy and enforce policy is often a much greater determinant of illicit trade. Fourth, we find that that tobacco taxes work. Even in the presence of illicit trade, we find that tobacco tax increases, tax reforms are able to ensure that the policy goals of increased revenue and reduced tobacco use are in almost all cases the outcome that we see. Fifthly, if governments are concerned about the levels of illicit trade or are concerned about increases in illicit trade, there are many measures that they can take to reform systems, whether it's on the policy side, the administration side, or the enforcement side, that are able to reduce the levels of illicit trade, even while increasing tobacco taxes. We find that improvements in general tax administration, or even very specific measures like technological solutions like track and trace systems, and broadly the measures that are found within the WHO FCTC illicit trade protocol are likely to help governments design better tax administration and enforcement systems. Next slide. I want to delve deeper into that second key message, because that second key message is really what informs the toolkit that we're going to speak about today. We said that the evidence shows that the tobacco industry typically exaggerates the scale and extent of illicit trade. And so what we did in this white paper was review a lot of empirical evidence where independent estimates, often by academics and even sometimes by governments, that use transparent methodologies and methodologies that are well accepted within the literature, find that the levels of illicit trade are lower than the industry claims, that the trends aren't always increasing. So what we wanted to do within the context of this toolkit was to provide a methodological guide, a how-to guide, some assistance for researchers, for practitioners, to be able to choose what methodologies to apply in their own countries, and not only what methodologies to apply, but also to implement those methodologies and conduct good, rigorous, transparent, and replicable research to estimate the levels of illicit trade in their own countries, and to estimate, in using some methods, the trends in illicit trade over time. So that was really, the genesis of the toolkit, and it really comes from as a supporting tool to this white paper. As in sort of call it an appendix to the white paper, we also did some more detailed country case studies. If we can go to the next slide. We did 4 country case studies for the purpose of supporting the white paper. The first one was a case study on Colombia that was produced by Mauricio Cardenas. And what really that showed was that, Colombia was a typical example of a country that delayed action, that didn't take action in terms of raising tobacco taxes because of the fear of illicit trade, and that was likely unfounded. And as we've seen since then, Colombia has implemented a lot of really good measures that are able to reduce illicit trade and deal with illicit trade, particularly smuggling issues. And what we've seen is higher taxes resulted in higher tax revenues, and showing that the typical concerns about illicit trade were exaggerated. In the next slide, please, we also looked at the Philippines, and the Philippines is one of the more spoken about examples in the last 10 years of successful tobacco tax policy, where we've seen significant increases in tax rates and also reform of the tax structure to a uniform specific tax. This case study was done by Joanne Diseona and Mans Tahana from the Actions for Economic Reforms in the Philippines. And they really show that the tax increases brought about the desired outcomes of increased revenue, reduced tobacco use, and highlighted the changes or improvements in tax administration, including fiscal marks in the Philippines that were able to ensure that this was well implemented. They also highlight a number of measures that the Philippines could continue to implement to further reinforce tax administration capacity. And the next slide, please. The next case study is on South Africa, my home country, and this was done by Corne van Walbeek from the University of Cape Town. And what was really interesting about the South African example is how South Africa spent almost 2 decades raising tobacco taxes dramatically, seeing increased prices, massively increased revenues, and reduced tobacco use. But in those first sort of 10, 20 years when tobacco taxes were increasing, we didn't see a growth in the illicit market. What we've seen is a significant growth in the illicit market in the last decade, which didn't coincide with tax increases. And in actual fact, what Corne highlights quite impressively is the role of the poor governance, a collapse of the tax administration system, not specific to tobacco, but more generically in South Africa, and how this led to increased levels of illicit trade. Also, what he highlights is how multinational tobacco companies exploited this for their own strategic purposes and competition within the market. I think it's a very, very interesting case study. And the last case study on the next slide is that of the UK. And the UK is an interesting one because it's seen at times in the past relatively high levels of illicit trade, and it's also seen massive declines in illicit trade as government took very strong measures, particularly through the enforcement side, to reduce illicit trade. What we've also seen is how taxes have increased considerably and consistently over long periods of time in illicit trade. And there is absolutely no correlation between the tax policy and the illicit trade. In actual fact, no relationship whatsoever. Also, what this highlights is that the UK have taken a very comprehensive approach that was different to the other countries. It focused a lot more on enforcement than the tax administration side, and it's a particularly interesting case study as well. So that's all available on the website. I think some of them are translated into multiple languages. I'm not sure which ones are translated into which languages, but do have a look at the Tobacconomics website and have a look at them. And I hope that they're really, really useful. I don't want to take any further time, and at this point, hand it over to Michal and Guillermo, who can take us through in more detail the toolkit and the methodological elements of the toolkit.
Evan, next slide, please. So in my presentation, I will focus on the methods to measure illicit cigarettes trade using pack examination studies. But first, let me spend a few minutes about explaining about the document itself and the toolkit that we wrote and the purpose of it. So the toolkit is designed to prepare researchers who want to implement the studies to examine illicit trade in tobacco products. It provides a step-by-step guidance on how to plan and execute those studies. And unlike the previous Tobacconomics toolkit that was focused on household survey data and measuring price elasticities using those data, that previous toolkit was using a well-established methodology. Here, the methods to estimate illicit trade in tobacco products are still evolving. Nothing is set in stone. Nobody won a Nobel Prize in Economics for estimating illicit trade in tobacco products. Therefore, in this toolkit, we build on the experience of different research groups that worked on estimating illicit trade in tobacco products in different countries around the world. And each of those groups had a little bit different approach. We described those approaches. And I see that many of those researchers actually are here today and listening to to the webinar. And next slide, please. So off to the pack examination studies. Consuming and trading illicit products, any illicit product, is often done in secrecy. So it's very hard to estimate illicit trade in tobacco products. But if you look at the pack, the tobacco product pack, there are several features that actually allow you to distinguish whether that pack is legal or not. And those features will differ from country to country, and in some countries it's a tax stamp and the proper health warning. Some countries have a list of brands that are allowed legally on the market, so the brand would be the feature that would be distinguishing illicit cigarettes. So we can learn a lot about illicit trade by looking at those packs. Next slide, please. And there are many places where we could observe those packs, and the toolkit focuses on two of those methods of examining cigarette packs. So the first method is a lettered pack collection, where a person goes along a pre-designed route along the street and collects all packs that are lettered on those streets, and then those packs can be examined. The other method is a smoker survey, where you go to the smoker and say, hey, could you show me your cigarette pack? And they show the pack, and you can look at the pack and see and examine all the features of that pack. Next slide, please. In our toolkit, we spend a lot of time talking about the sampling in those studies. And my suspicion is that among the listeners to this webinar, there are many people who successfully implemented population surveys for public health in their countries. And you might know a lot about sampling already, but there are several issues that make the estimation of illicit trade in tobacco products using pack examination that makes this sampling a little bit different. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we spent a lot of time discussing that is a little bit not intuitive for every statistician is that that we are sampling products and not people here. And for example, in Brazil, our collaborators Valesca Figueiredo and Andres Klo went out of their way to predict where the smokers live to have a proper sampling frame. So if an average smoker is poorer than an average person in the country, we have to proportionally more often go to places where poorer people live to have a representative sample of smokers. And then our colleagues from Brazil weighted the responses by those smokers in their smoker survey by the intensity of smoking by those smokers. So one person smokes a pack of cigarettes a day, the other person smokes a pack of cigarettes a week. And we have to take it into account because remember, this is a study of the packs and not of the people. So we discuss this example in the toolkit and actually provide a code for a statistical software that people, that researchers around the world can take and implement in their studies if they want to use this particular method. Next slide, please. Another issue that is not intuitive to every statistician is how to design those routes along which the packs will be collected in the littered pack collection study. And here is an example of the study that Hannah Ross and I conducted in Poland, my home country. We randomly selected 30 geographical areas in the city of Warsaw. These are the blue areas on the map. And within each area, we designed a 3-kilometer route along which the packs were collected. We discussed this study. We discussed a study by our colleagues from Argentina, and the study in Chicago that David Merriman conducted. And actually, each of those 3 studies took a little bit different angle, a little bit different approach to select those geographical regions and to design those routes. And those differences are discussed in the toolkit. Next slide. Data collection. We actually provide a sample survey instrument. It is very important to ask the right questions in the surveys of smokers. I actually read several studies of illicit trade in tobacco products where the survey was asking, have you ever smoked illicit cigarettes? So if I smoked an illicit cigarette 20 years ago, my answer to that question in that survey would be yes. But this would not, this answer of mine would be irrelevant to inform the researchers who want to estimate the current state of illicit trade in the country. So we discuss it in the survey, in the toolkit. Next slide, please. And finally, data analysis. Using pack examination studies, we can learn who is smoking those illicit cigarettes. And this is particularly easy in a survey of smokers, but even in those littered pack collections, we see different levels of illicit trade in different neighborhoods, and that informs us who is smoking those illicit cigarettes. And last but not least, where are those cigarettes coming from? I'm actually right now looking through the pictures of packs that were taken during a survey of smokers executed in southeastern Europe. That is the survey that was conducted by our groups and funded by Tobacconomics. So among those packs, among those pictures, I see Trocadero cigarettes that are likely produced in North Macedonia, and so they are local. I see Manchester cigarettes. I think they were produced in a tax-free zone in United Arab Emirates, so they came by ship to Southeastern Europe. I see some cigarettes that come from China. So this kind of information clearly is exciting to me, but it's also very relevant for the customs and for other government agencies. Because remember, we do those studies to inform policy making. We do those studies to inform the implementation of policies. Another very relevant method to estimate illicit cigarette trade is gap analysis, and for that I'll hand the microphone to my colleague Guillermo Paraje from Chile.
Thank you, Michal. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to present a brief introduction to this model. Basically, the gap model compares the evolution of what people report to have consumed, in this case, cigarettes, and the evolution of tax paid recorded sales. So basically, people who smoke basically can consume licit or illicit cigarettes. The licit cigarettes can be tax paid cigarettes that have been sold in the country and have paid the tobacco taxes. Could also be cigarettes that were bought abroad using the allowances the allowances that the country may have to bring in legally an amount of cigarettes. Could be also bought in duty free, also legally, and still not paying taxes, or in the other case could be illicit cigarettes that have been smuggled in and not paid any tax. So basically, this model, what it does is to compare the evolution of the cigarettes that have been consumed to the cigarettes that have paid taxes within the country. So the first piece of information we need is surveys that can give us estimates of cigarette consumption. And these surveys are usually collected in regular intervals of time in many countries. And from these surveys, we need three variables, at least three variables. One is the number of smokers per unit of time, for instance, month. Usually the surveys ask about if a person have smoked it in the past 30 days or in the past year of the previous to the sample to the survey. Usually it's better to use the shortest period of time to have a more precise estimates and not subjected to a recall bias. So we need number of smokers per unit of time. We also need the average number of cigarettes that a smoker reports to have smoked daily, and also the number of days in that period of time that the smoker have reported to smoke. Sometimes in the survey, the smoker is paid how much do you, or how many cigarettes do you smoke in a regular or in an average day. It doesn't ask about the number of days. And with that question, we can also estimate the consumption. So with these three variables, just multiplying the number of smokers by the number of days smoked by the average cigarettes that the smoker reports to have smoked per day, we can have an idea of how many cigarettes have been smoked in that unit of time. Next, please. So what we find consistently is that reported consumption is usually less than the actual use, the actual consumption of cigarettes. There is some underreporting, again, which is consistently found in countries that have used this model, and can be quite substantial. So because of that underreporting, we cannot compare, we cannot take the difference between tax paid cigarettes and the amount consumed as an indication of illicit trade, because what happens is the actual or the reported consumption is less than the tax paid sales, which is nonsensically usually. So what we do is to compare the evolution of these two variables, as will be seen in the next graphs. And from that evolution, we can have evidence whether the illicit trade has increased or decreased as a proportion of the market. A few caveats. Surveys have to be representative of as large a population as possible. So, for instance, we would like to have smoking status of population for the entire population over 12, for instance, in some countries, or over 15 in other countries. In the cases that we do not have that, and we have, for instance, surveys that are representative of population between 18 and 65, we have to assume that consumption of that population the proportion of the consumption of that population over the total consumption is constant over time. So there are no changes in the intensity of smoking among groups that are covered by the survey and groups that are not covered by the survey. Another assumption which is important is that this underreporting is constant over time. That can be a challenging assumption in cases where smoking surveys are too far apart in times. In cases where surveys are closer in times, 2 years, 1 year, that assumption is more, is more realistic. The other thing that we have to consider is that in some countries, not in all countries, some countries serve as like a trampoline to smuggling cigarettes out to other countries. So cigarettes pay taxes in these countries, and then they are smuggled out to other countries. We have to consider those cases to adjust the model and not to underestimate the illegal trade in that country, because tax-paid cigarettes in that case are higher than the actual consumption. In that case, when we have that, of course, it's difficult to have accurate estimates of this smuggling out of cigarettes. We have to also assume that this smuggling out is constant over time as a proportion of the total tax paid cigarettes in the country. Next, please. So this is a case of the GAP method applied to South Africa from 2008 to 2017, because the orange line is self-reported consumption from survey. Because this data come from survey, it's subjected to a statistical uncertainty. So we have to ideally estimate also confidence intervals, which are the dotted lines just above and below that orange line. And the black line is tax-paid cigarettes. So, for instance, in 2010, we see that tax-paid cigarettes are below the self-reported consumption, but that is within the confidence interval. So there are no statistical differences between these two quantities, these two estimates in terms of trends. So nothing can be said about illicit trade, or we could say that illicit trade has been constant between 2008 and 2010. But for 2017, the black line is outside the confidence interval, and in that case, we can say that in statistical terms, illicit trade has increased between, for instance, 2008 and 2017. So that is what the gap model allowed us to say. Next, please. These are two other cases for South America, for Argentina and Brazil. In the case of Argentina, the total sticks that paid taxes are above the estimated, the consumed total cigarettes. So in that case, illicit trade is decreasing. That is well above the confidence, the upper confidence limit. So in that case, we can say that illicit trade is decreasing. In the case of Brazil, is the opposite. Illicit trade is increasing because the registered sales are below the confidence interval of the reported consumption from users survey. Now, it is very important to be careful about these increasing, decreasing statements. It's not the same. It's not the same to say that illicit trade is increasing in the case of South Africa, for instance, where the market seems to be stable, consumption is pretty stable across time, than in the case of Brazil, where consumption is decreasing, clearly decreasing. In the case of Brazil, illicit trade is increasing in a shrinking market, which may mean that total illicit cigarettes that are consumed in Brazil are also decreasing. Next, please. So the main strength of the model, and it has some complexities, but it's really what I have just tried to show. It's a model that is very easy to apply. You don't need to collect data as in the methods that Michal just presented. The data is usually available. Tax collection or the number of cigarettes that have paid taxes is usually a public information. Sometimes you don't have the number of sticks that pay taxes. You have the revenue in US dollars or in the local currency. In that case, if the country has a specific excise, you can divide this total collection by the tax that pays every sticks, and you have an estimation, a number of the sticks that have paid taxes. In the case the country does not have a specific excise, it's a bit more complex, and sometimes you cannot get the actual number. Also, the interpretation is quite straightforward, and it's very clear what the model measures and the model does not measure. Next, please. The limitations of the model does not provide a precise estimate of the volume of the illicit trade or the proportion of the illicit trade. If you have a previous estimate, for instance, of the size of the illicit trade, for instance, from one of Michal's method, then you can make an estimate of the actual volume, because you pinpoint in one point of time the size of the illicit trade, and then through the evolution you can estimate the evolution of that size. The method, I would say that the strongest limitation is that relies heavily on this assumption of a fixed underreporting proportion or a fixed consumption for certain population groups. If that population is unrealistic, the method should be used with extreme care or not used at all. Next, please. Main conclusion is that the method that provides a quick, easy, cheap estimate sometimes to debunk facts or myths that are raised by the tobacco industry in terms of illicit trade. We need to be careful about not to overstate the evidence that this method provides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, Michal and Evan, for great presentations. I want to go now. We've received quite a few of very good questions through our Q&A box, also the chat box. So feel free to go ahead and enter your questions. But let's kick it off. Hannah Ross has a question about, I think this one's for you, Michal. It says, what is your opinion on assessing illicit cigarette market using chemical analysis of sewage? That sounds like a fun task.
I can imagine that chemical assessment can be used to estimate, to determine whether people smoke or not smoke cigarettes. I'm not sure how. Maybe Hannah could give us a hint how to determine whether those packs, whether those cigarettes are illicit.
Yeah, that's a good question. Evan, do you have?
If I could jump in here, yeah. I mean, I think the early studies that I've seen that look at the wastewater using the chemical analysis is from Australia. And what they were, and in Australia, they've been using wastewater studies to look at trends in usage and trends in space geographically of many things, including illicit drugs, including bacterial virus pathogens, for instance. And it allows, the development of the method was ultimately to sort of be an early warning indicator of a whole bunch of different things. From what I understand is that it's really similar to the GAP method, and it's able to, if you look over time, particularly understand the trends in tobacco use, and to use that as a proxy of measuring tobacco use as an alternative to a survey for the GAP method. What I've seen more recently is when people have been using wastewater studies to look at prevalence of COVID as a specific example of how it's used in infectious diseases, that there's a lot of, I can't say controversy, but there's a lot of discussion about the chemical analysis and the quality of the chemical analysis and the consistency of the chemical analysis. But what the research in Australia has shown is that illicit trade levels are particularly low in Australia, and that the trends in consumption of tobacco use are declining. But if you try to look at it to measure the level of illicit trade, it does take some substantial leaps of faith in terms of the assumptions to do it. That said, I think if we look at a new emerging method for doing it, I do think that the wastewater studies are a really innovative way to do it. I did have a chat with Carl Gartner, one of the researchers in Brisbane who's been involved in it. And one of the challenges with wastewater studies is cost, is that they're not that cheap, because you do have to do a fair bit of chemical analysis that needs to get done in external laboratories. So I think that is a useful method. It also is limited in terms of where you can do it, potentially based on access to wastewater and consistent access to wastewater. That would be another limitation of that. But I do think it is a potential complementary method with gap analysis. And what would really be interesting is to see doing gap analysis and wastewater studies in the same location at similar times, and to see how those results compare to each other.
So what you're saying is actually a gap method study. If we have a stable tax paid sales, but the wastewater shows that people start consuming more and more cigarettes all of a sudden, it might indicate that those cigarettes come from illicit sources.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's quickly turn to the next question because we've got quite a few and a limited amount of time. So here's another proposal from Praveen. He says that police seize the illicit cigarettes and that information, including the number of cigarettes, the total value of seized tobacco, is published in the newspaper. How can this data be used to help measure illicit trade? Michal?
It is tricky because cigarette seizures is actually just a portion of whole illicit cigarette trade. I used this method to demonstrate that the industry claims about the growing illicit numbers in menthol cigarettes are true in Canada, that in Nova Scotia, that actually implemented the illicit, the ban on menthol cigarettes. The industry was saying there is a huge growth in illicit menthol cigarettes. We showed that the seizure data was actually declining, and among the seized cigarettes there were non-menthol cigarettes. But I would call it more like an investigative journalism than actual study. So I don't think that the seizure data provides some indicate, but it would be hard to base any analysis of the trends in illicit trade based on that data.
Yeah, just one more thing is seizures of illicit cigarettes is a measure of state effectiveness of to seizures of illicit cigarettes. So we usually are very careful, and I would say extreme skeptical about these figures.
Okay, we have another question from David Merriman. He says that one method of measuring consumption of illicit tobacco is to simply ask people how much illicit consumption they have done. The US CPS tobacco supplement asked this kind of question, for example. However, when we compare national estimates of illicit consumption done in this manner with estimates of illicit consumption obtained using physical pack estimates, for example, littered pack, we seem to consistently find lower levels of reported illicit consumption in the survey data. Any ideas why we might be getting this sort of result? So asking people versus physical pack or littered pack inspections.
I think it's not only in the US. It's I would say, as much as I know, everyone. I think it is this issue of underreporting. Smokers do tend to underreport the amount they smoke in general. I don't see why they would not underreport illicit consumption. I think that is what David is asking, but I would also give the floor to Michal.
I completely agree with Guillermo, and in some places there is a problem of cigarette counterfeiting. So the pack of cigarettes that actually looks like a real pack, but was not produced by a legitimate manufacturer, and the tax wasn't paid on that pack. And we discussed it a little bit actually in our toolkit. The light microscopy and subjecting the packs to some ultraviolet irradiation could tell us a little bit. There were, if the packs are counterfeit or not, there were studies conducted by Dr. Courtney here in the US. We collaborated in a study in Argentina where actually they found a lot of counterfeit tax stamps as well. My point is that if you ask a person, is that pack illicit, that they might not know if it's illicit. It would require actually very close examination by the researchers to determine if that pack is illicit or not.
I think it's good that we bring out some of the limitations like underreporting, especially to the gap analysis. I was thinking also, Guillermo, about the presence of tourists, because you're trying to figure out what the consumption of cigarettes is in a population. But if you have a country with, you know, high tourism, then you will probably get a lot of cigarette sales of people who don't live there. Is that correct?
Yeah, but again, I think that in that case, you have to assume that the proportion of consumption from tourists is relatively constant across time. And for that, of course, you can look at number of tourists that enter the country every year. If you cannot assume that, then I would say that the gap method is not the proper method to measure evolution. If you have huge swings in the numbers of tourists entering the country, then in that case, I don't know, for instance, the Olympics or the football or soccer World Cup. I mean, in those events, of course, the quantities can be somehow distorted because of the presence of an enormous amount of people from abroad.
Another question that we have, and sorry, it's time to blow the leaves in the autumn here in Chicago, so there's some noise. Another question that we have from RJ Mercado is, given the restricted mobility brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, are there needed adjustments so that the toolkit can still be usable if researchers are limited to online platforms? I know that we go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cool thing, you know, I definitely think that doing original data collection at the moment is relatively difficult. So, you know, obviously collecting packs or doing surveys of smokers would have some challenges. That's not to say you can't do it, but you would need to be able to do it within, you know, the regulatory protocols and safety protocols that are varying so much from country to country and over time. So it would be difficult to predict where and how you could do an original data collection. But the GAP method is using secondary data collection and is using relatively, hopefully you would say relatively recent, but historical data. And one would still be able to implement GAP methods and still implement other secondary data methods of maybe existing surveys of smokers, even in the environment of COVID. But I think it would create disruption to potential original data collection, and one just needs to be very aware of it. Obviously, if you're allowed to do data collection in a specific environment, you could you know, follow various safety protocols and still collect that data. I think that's possible. I think a complicating factor with respect to COVID, not about necessarily the data collection, is what disruption there may have been to various data streams and even smoking behavior as a result of COVID. And we have seen a fair bit of changes in different ways in different countries. And that's no different to any series of macroeconomic or other microeconomic data in the world this year. I think 2020 is going to be, in many years to come, we'll look back in 2020 is going to be a massive structural break in data. And it's going to take a bit of innovation and a bit of adaptability from researchers in order to adjust to that data going forward, whether it's you know, something like inflation data, where there's definitely going to be structural breaks, and even issues with data quality. I'm seeing already in many countries concerns about, you know, something like an unemployment data, of not being able to collect that consistently with the way that data has been collected in the past because of changes in the way we've had to do surveys or inability to do surveys easily. So it's going to be a challenge, not just for working on tobacco taxation, but broadly within economic data in coming years.
Okay, thank you, Evan. And the next question, and we have 3 minutes left, so I just want us to be aware of that, and we'll probably have to get to the other. There were very good questions. So we will answer those through email, so don't worry. But the next question is, it was mentioned a while ago that estimates from the industry tend to be overestimated. So what methods can be employed to assess whether illicit trade measurements are overestimated?
The whole point is that the tobacco industry often doesn't report the method that they used. A scientific method is a method that has known methodology and is actually replicable. And those surveys are often, those estimates from the tobacco industry do not meet those requirements, so we actually cannot know why they are overestimated. There are some instances where the tobacco industry were telling us how they estimated illicit cigarette trade, usually using the pack collections, and we know from for example, UK, where they went around sports stadiums after the big events and collected the packs. And of course, there were a lot of foreign packs because a lot of foreign fans were coming to those games. The same was done by Tobias' efforts in Germany, where he was showing that the industry was oversampling the areas along the borders with Poland, around the US military bases, where actually you again would expect more illicit or foreign cigarettes.
Thank you, Michal. I think that was a great wrap up. And I think that question just emphasizes the importance of this toolkit and transparent methodologies to measure illicit trade, and to know what they can accomplish and what they can't accomplish. So we really hope that the materials and especially the toolkit is helpful and usable by all of you. And so please reach out. We'll send a survey. If you would like to hear more on the toolkit or specifically the case studies, we had a really good question about tax administration. Please let us know. And that way we can plan webinars like this in the future to make it more about tax administration. So do let us know, respond to that survey. Thank you again for your time. Thank you to Guillermo, to Evan, to Michal. We really appreciate your expertise and your time. So have a good day, everyone.